When the lawyer first called, I thought it was a mistake. Nobody leaves you land out of the blue, not in my family. We were the kind of people who left behind debts, broken lawn mowers, and stories that got bigger every year. Not land, but the papers were real. 6 acres just outside town, overgrown, untouched for decades. And according to the will, it was mine. I hadn't been back there since I was a kid. I barely remembered the place. Just flashes, tall grass brushing my knees, the smell of rust and oil, my grandfather's laugh carrying across the field like he was king of something nobody else understood. The first time I drove back after signing the documents, I almost missed the turn. The dirt road was narrower than I remembered. Trees leaned in from both sides like they were trying to hide whatever waited at the end. And then I saw them. Cars. Dozens of them. Not lined up neatly. Not protected. Just sitting there in the grass like forgotten soldiers. Hoods eaten by rust. Windshields clouded over. Chrome dulled. Moss creeping over fenders like time had decided to finish what neglect started. At first glance, it looked like a graveyard, but if you stood there long enough, you could feel it wasn't death. It was pause. Front and center, half swallowed by weeds, was the one I remembered most. The long body, the aggressive stance. Even under rust, it still looked like it meant something. The Dodge Charger. My grandfather used to say, "That car's got a heartbeat, you just gotta listen." I didn't understand him then. I do now. The Charger's paint had once been black, deep, mirror black. Now it was a patchwork of oxidation and bare metal. The hood scoop was still intact, the badge on the grille barely readable, but there, defiant, Dodge Charger. Of all the cars on that land, the old Fords, the Chevrolets, the early 30s coupes with cracked wooden wheels, that Charger felt different. It wasn't just metal, it was legacy. I walked up to it slowly, like approaching an animal that might spook. My boots pressed into the damp earth. Grass scraped against my jeans. I reached out and placed my hand on the hood. Cold, but solid. "I'm home," I said, and it surprised me that I meant it. The house on the property was long gone, burned down sometime in the late 80s. All that remained was the detached garage. Inside, it felt like stepping into a frozen memory. Tools hung where they'd last been placed, old manuals stacked on a shelf, photographs pinned to the wall, faded, curling at the edges. There was one of my grandfather standing next to that Charger, clean, polished, engine gleaming, his grin wide and proud. He wasn't a rich man, he wasn't famous, but standing beside that car, he looked like he owned the world. I sat on an old wooden stool in that garage and just stared at the photo for a long time. I had a life in the city, a job, bills, noise, deadlines. Nothing romantic about it. But standing there, surrounded by silent engines and the smell of old oil soaked into wood, something shifted. This wasn't just land, it was responsibility. The next morning, I came back with gloves. I started small, clearing weeds from around the Charger, pulling vines off the mirrors, brushing away leaves that had collected along the windshield. Underneath the decay, I could see lines, intentional design, strength. The Charger wasn't the oldest car there. It wasn't the rarest either. But it was the one that carried the story forward. Every bolt I touched felt like a conversation with the past. I found the keys 2 days later, in a coffee tin labeled spark plugs, wrapped in cloth. Heavy, cold, waiting. I didn't try to start it, not yet. Resurrection isn't rushed. People think restoring cars is about polish and shine. It's not. It's about patience. It's about learning the scars before you try to hide them. Over the next weeks, I made trips back and forth. I told my boss I needed time. I didn't tell him why. I don't think he would have understood. I began cataloging everything on the property, each car, each model, each year I could identify. A 1930 Ford Model A, roof caved slightly but body surprisingly intact. A 1955 Chevy Bel Air, two-tone paint barely visible under rust, a 1967 Pontiac that still had the original wheels, and then the Charger, 1969, numbers matching. If the engine block plate inside the garage was to be believed, that changed everything. It wasn't just sentimental, it was special. I remember the first night I stayed out there late. The sun dipped behind the trees and the field turned gold. Shadows stretched long across the cars, and for a second it felt like they were waking up, like they were waiting. I ran my hand along the Charger's fender again. "I'm going to bring you back," I said quietly. And for the first time in years, I felt certain about something. I wasn't just inheriting land. I was inheriting unfinished work. And of all the steel resting under open sky, the one I am most proud of, the one I will restore first, the one that carries my grandfather's grin in its reflection, is that Dodge Charger. Not because it's perfect, but because it's ours. The first real test wasn't turning the key, it was lifting the hood. I waited almost 3 weeks before I did it. 3 weeks of clearing brush, sorting tools, draining old fuel from forgotten tanks, hauling scrap out of the garage. I needed the place to feel less like a ruin and more like a workshop before I touched the heart of the Charger. When I finally released the hood latch, the metal groaned like it was waking from a long sleep. Underneath, dust, leaves, a nest tucked into the corner near the battery tray. Time had been living in here, quietly. But beneath the debris, the engine was still there, massive, solid. A 440 Magnum block, just like my grandfather used to brag about. I wiped a circle clean on the valve cover with my sleeve. There it was, numbers matching. That confirmation didn't make me smile. It made me still. Because now it wasn't just a car with history. It was the car, the one he raced on back roads in the 70s, the one he refused to sell when money was tight, the one my grandmother complained about because it took up space but secretly loved because of the way he looked at it. I found more photographs inside the garage later that week, not framed, just tucked between manuals and invoices. One showed the Charger parked in front of a small-town drag strip. Another showed my grandfather and a group of young men leaning against it, cigarettes in hand, engines still ticking from heat. On the back of one photo he'd written, "Built, not bought." That sentence hit harder than anything else, because I realized something standing there among the dust and fading light. He never finished building it. The engine had been pulled at some point. I found the original carburetor in a box labeled "Later." The transmission was out, suspension parts stacked neatly along the wall like he intended to return. And then life must have intervened. Age, health, maybe money, maybe regret. The work stopped. The Charger became potential instead of motion, and now that potential belonged to me. The first night I decided to stay over, I brought a folding cot and a lantern. The garage still had power, surprisingly. Old wiring, but functional. I sat on that same wooden stool where I'd first studied his photograph and just listened. At night, the land sounded different. Wind through tall grass, insects, the occasional creak of cooling metal from cars that hadn't moved in decades. But in my head, I heard something else. Engines. The next morning, I made a list. Not romantic, not dramatic, just practical. Full engine teardown, replace fuel lines, inspect frame for structural rust, rebuild carb, new wiring harness, suspension rebuild, brake system from scratch. It wasn't a project, it was a commitment. Friends from the city started calling less when I kept turning down invitations. I didn't explain much. Working on something, I'd say. They pictured a hobby. This wasn't a hobby, this was identity being reclaimed piece by piece. I began with the engine block, pulled it carefully, set it on a stand. Every bolt resisted at first, like it was testing whether I deserved to continue. I documented everything. Photos, measurements, serial numbers. When I disassembled the heads, I half expected disaster, cracked walls, corrosion beyond saving. Instead, I found strength. Yes, it needed machining. Yes, seals were gone. Yes, time had taken its share. But it wasn't dead. and that realization changed something in me. The charger wasn't a relic. It was waiting. One afternoon, while sorting through a cabinet, I found an envelope addressed to me, my name written in my grandfather's handwriting. I sat down immediately. Inside was a short note. "If you're reading this, you came back. That means you understand." That was it. No instructions, no sentimental speech, just certainty. You came back. That was the turning point. This wasn't about restoring an object. It was about finishing something started long before I understood its value. Over the next months, the land began to look different. The grass trimmed, paths cleared between the vehicles. I set up tarps, ordered parts, built shelves for cleaned components. I started on smaller cars too, enough to keep perspective. The Model A's wheels freed up easier than expected. The Chevy Bel Air had interior pieces that might still be salvageable. But everything revolved around the Charger. Every time I stepped onto the property, my eyes went to it first. Even covered in primer and surface rust, it commanded space. I removed the interior carefully, seats brittle but frames intact, dashboard surprisingly complete. Under the passenger seat, I found a matchbook from a roadside diner long gone. Evidence of life lived at full throttle. One evening, as I sat cleaning the original steering wheel, I realized something that startled me. I was smiling the same way he did in that photo. Not because it was easy, but because it was meaningful. People measure success by what moves forward. I was finding mine in what I refused to let disappear. The first time I reassembled the lower end of the engine, torqued everything to spec, and stepped back, I felt a quiet pride I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't flashy. There were no spectators, just metal, memory, and intention. I haven't turned the key yet. That moment will come. But when it does, it won't just be ignition. It will be continuation. And out of all the cars resting on this inherited land, out of every rusted fender and silent chassis, the one I am most proud of, the one that carries my grandfather's unfinished sentence, is the Dodge Charger. Because restoring it isn't about nostalgia. It's about proving that some things deserve to roar again. The day I decided to fire the engine for the first time, the sky was overcast. I don't know why that matters, but it does. It felt right that the moment wouldn't be cinematic. No golden sunset, no dramatic wind, just gray clouds hanging low, like the world was holding its breath without making a show of it. The engine was back in the bay, fresh gaskets, new fuel lines, rebuilt carburetor, cleaned tank, rewired ignition. I had triple-checked every connection, torque specs memorized, fluids filled. On paper, it should have worked, but paper doesn't account for doubt. I stood in front of the Charger with the hood open, staring at it longer than necessary. My hands were clean for once. That felt wrong, too ceremonial. I climbed into the driver's seat. The interior smelled like old vinyl and metal dust. I'd cleaned it, but some things don't leave. They settle into the structure. The steering wheel felt heavier than I remembered. The key was the same one I found in the coffee tin, cold against my fingers. I didn't turn it immediately. Instead, I thought about the first time my grandfather must have done this after rebuilding it decades ago. Did he hesitate, or did he trust himself completely? I wasn't sure which answer scared me more. I pumped the gas once, turned the key. The starter engaged. The engine cranked. Slow at first, heavy rotation, like something ancient stretching stiff limbs. Crank, crank, crank. Nothing. I stopped. Silence. My heartbeat was louder than the motor. I tried again. Crank, crank. A cough this time. A brief, hollow pop from the exhaust. And then nothing again. I leaned back in the seat and exhaled slowly. This is the part nobody films. The part where doubt walks in quietly and sits beside you. I stepped out, checked the fuel line again, spark plugs, distributor timing. Everything seemed correct. Back in the seat. Key turned. Crank, crank, crank. A sharper ignition. A sputter. A violent shake that ran through the frame. And then it caught. Not smoothly, not proudly. It stumbled into life like it wasn't sure it wanted to commit. The engine roared unevenly, coughing black smoke into the gray sky. The entire car trembled. The sound wasn't polished muscle. It was raw combustion, imperfect, alive. I didn't move. I just held the steering wheel and listened. The Charger wasn't dead. It was angry. And that was better. I eased the throttle carefully. RPM climbed. The vibrations settled slightly. Oil pressure held steady, temperature rising but controlled. I laughed. Actually laughed. Not the kind of laugh you give people. The kind that escapes when relief hits harder than pride. After about 30 seconds, it stalled, just died. Silence again. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't failure. It was progress. I climbed out and walked to the front of the car. Smoke drifted upward in thin lines. The metal ticked as it cooled, the sound of hot steel adjusting after heat. I placed my hand on the fender. "You're coming back," I said quietly. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in the garage, reviewing everything. Fuel mixture too rich, idle adjustment off, timing slightly advanced. Small corrections. The next morning I tried again. This time it started faster. Still rough, but steadier. The idle settled after a minute. The exhaust tone deepened. Less chaotic, more intentional. That was the first time I heard it clearly. That low, unmistakable rumble. The kind of sound that doesn't ask permission. I shut it off before pushing my luck. Restoration isn't about forcing miracles. It's about respecting limits. Over the next weeks, setbacks came in waves. Brake lines failed pressure tests. Rear suspension bushings disintegrated when I removed them. I discovered rust along part of the frame rail I hadn't noticed earlier. There was one afternoon when I sat on the garage floor, back against the wall, staring at the Charger and wondering if I had underestimated everything. Money was tightening. Time was slipping. The city job was starting to feel distant, like a previous life I had only half stepped away from. Was I rebuilding a car? Or hiding from something? That question stayed with me for days, until I found another detail. Behind the garage shelf, tucked inside an old toolbox, I found a notebook. My grandfather's handwriting filled the pages. Measurements, torque values, notes about suspension geometry, observations about carb tuning in humid weather. And on the last page, one line, "Don't rush what's worth keeping." That answered it. This wasn't escape. This was alignment. I wasn't trying to relive his life. I was continuing a part of mine that had been waiting. The land began to transform more noticeably as months passed. I built a proper workshop area, installed better lighting, cleared space around the other cars so I could evaluate them properly. I started planning their restorations too. The Model A would come second, a gentler rebuild. The Bel Air after that. But the Charger remained the standard. Every improvement on the property seemed to orbit it. People started stopping by, curious neighbors who had seen activity where there used to be stillness. They'd ask what I planned to do with the cars. Restore them, I'd say. All of them? Eventually. They'd look at the Charger and nod. That one makes sense. And that's when I realized something important. Even strangers could feel it. That Dodge Charger wasn't just another vehicle on inherited land. It was the anchor, the symbol, the reason I came back. The first time I rolled it forward a few feet under its own power, just enough to reposition it in the garage, I felt something settle inside me. Not excitement, not adrenaline, certainty. I am most proud of that Charger not because it's rare or valuable, not because it will shine when finished, but because bringing it back proves that time doesn't always win. Steel can return, engines can speak again, and land that once looked abandoned can become purpose. I haven't driven it down the road yet. That moment will come. But when it does, it won't just be about horsepower. It will be about legacy moving forward instead of sitting in tall grass. And when the Charger finally rolls past the edge of that inherited field, engine steady, paint deep and restored, it won't just be a car leaving. It will be proof that I didn't just inherit land. I inherited responsibility, and I chose to answer it. The day I drove it out of the field, the sun finally showed up. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just clear, quiet, honest light. The Charger sat in the garage, fully assembled for the first time in decades. Fresh paint, still curing, deep black again, not overly glossy, not over-restored. I kept small imperfections, a faint ripple in one quarter panel, a tiny pitted section in the chrome I chose not to replace, because perfection erases history, and this car deserved its story. I stood in front of it for a long time that morning. The stance was right, suspension rebuilt, brakes solid, exhaust aligned, interior restored carefully, original gauge cluster refurbished, steering wheel preserved, seats reupholstered but patterned exactly as before. The engine bay looked strong but not sterile. It looked like it belonged to someone who uses tools. I opened the driver's door slowly. The hinges didn't creak anymore. I sat down. This time there was no hesitation. The key turned. The engine fired immediately. Deep, controlled rumble. No coughing, no shaking, just presence. The kind of sound that makes silence step aside. I let it idle for a minute, feeling the vibrations through the seat, through the steering column, into my hands. I eased it into gear. The Charger rolled forward. It wasn't fast, it wasn't dramatic. Just a slow, deliberate movement across the concrete and into the sunlight. When the front wheels crossed from shade to light, I felt something tighten in my chest. For years, this car had been a memory. Now, it was motion. I drove it slowly down the dirt path that I had cleared months earlier. The other cars stood on either side, silent witnesses. The Model A, the Bel Air, the old coupes and sedans that would get their turn. But today was about one thing. As the Charger reached the edge of the property, I stopped. This was the point where the land ended and the open road began. I could almost see my grandfather standing there in some parallel version of this moment. Arms crossed, not smiling, just watching, waiting to see what I would do. I pressed the gas. The engine responded immediately, strong, confident. The rear tires gripped the gravel and the Charger surged forward onto the paved road, and just like that, the past moved into the present. I didn't push it hard. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I let it stretch naturally. Let the gears settle. Let the engine breathe. The sound inside the cabin was controlled thunder. Every vibration felt earned. I drove for 20 minutes. No destination. Just space. And somewhere in that drive, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about one car. It was about reclaiming momentum. The land I inherited had once looked like abandonment, rust, weeds, silence. But abandonment is only permanent if you leave it alone. When I returned the Charger to the garage, I shut the engine off and sat there for a while. No rush to get out, no rush to celebrate. I had finished what he started, but I wasn't finished. Over the next months, the property evolved again. I built a proper sign at the entrance, not flashy, just simple lettering, Heritage Restoration, because that's what it had become. Neighbors started stopping by more often. Some offered old parts, some just came to talk. One older man brought photographs of a car he used to own that looked exactly like the Bel Air sitting in my field. Stories began attaching themselves to the land. The cars weren't scrap anymore. They were anchors for memory. I began planning the restoration order seriously. The Model A would be a careful preservation build, original patina kept. The Bel Air would get a full frame-off restoration. The Pontiac would be a performance rebuild. But no matter how many projects lined up, everything still revolved around the Charger. Because it proved something. It proved I could do it. It proved that legacy isn't passive. And of all the vehicles standing on that inherited ground, the one I am most proud of, the one that transformed a forgotten field into a purpose-driven life, will always be the Dodge Charger. Not because it's the loudest, not because it's the most valuable, but because it was first, because it taught me that rust is not the end, because it reminded me that some machines carry more than fuel. They carry unfinished stories. And now, when I stand in the garage at night and look out at the other cars waiting their turn, I don't see a graveyard. I see chapters. The land doesn't feel inherited anymore. It feels chosen. And every time I turn the key in that charger and hear it respond instantly, I know something simple and unshakable. I didn't just restore a car. I restored direction.